course, they've never candidly admitted this to either the larger scientific community or the general public, but it's basically a chronological train wreck. Even if you believe in the millions of years, you've got no good reason to trust those dates coming from the Milankovitch theory.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Creation Podcast, where we discuss the science that confirms Scripture. I'm your host, Renee, and we have a very special episode in store for you today. ICR science staff have spent more than 50 years researching scientific evidence that refutes evolutionary philosophy and confirms the Bible's account of a recent and special creation. Through their work, thousands of lives have been impacted with Christ's creation truth. But how does one become a creation scientist? What leads an individual down that particular vocational path? In this series, we'll be taking a look at the lives and journeys of several members of ICR's science staff to answer those questions. And joining me today is ICR physicist Dr. Jake Hebert. Dr. Hebert, welcome to the podcast.
Good afternoon, Renee. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Well, I am so excited for today's episode because really we're going to be talking about God's working in your life, how he led you to himself and also to this vocation of being in the creation science world and ultimately to ICR. So with that, I would love to just dive right in and start by just talking about your background. Did you grow up in a Christian household? What was it like for you as you were being raised?
Yes, I did grow up in a Christian household, although my dad was not necessarily a believer right away. He became a believer maybe a year or two before I did. So pretty much my entire life, we've been a Christian household. Yes.
Yeah. So whenever you were growing up, going to church with your family and being taught about Jesus, being taught about the gospel, was the doctrine of creation part of that? What did that look like?
Well, I'm sure it was, but it wasn't really an emphasis necessarily. You know, we were just a typical Christian family. You know, I don't know if we necessarily thought about that issue more than other people, but it later became important, and we can get into how that happened, but at first, we were just a typical, Christian family in Texas, not necessarily thinking about these issues a lot.
And so as you were, maybe not learning about creation specifically, but of course attending church,
right.
Learning biblical principles, how ultimately did Christ draw you to himself? I'd love to hear a little bit about your testimony of how that looked.
Well, the Lord really did obviously draw me to himself, because I was in the first grade, and one night out of the blue, I just wondered, well, how can I be sure I'm going to heaven? And it's like, well, I think that's really important to know that. And so, I asked my dad, who had been converted not too long before that, and he explained the gospel to me. And I prayed to receive Christ. Later on, I worry, though, about the sinner's prayer, because I think sometimes people use that as a substitute for belief in Christ. It's not a substitute. You've got to actually believe the message. And, the Bible says, we believe, therefore have we spoken, not I've spoken, therefore I believe. And so, but I'm convinced I was really born again at that time. And so, I feel like it was kind of interesting. It was, in some ways, I grew fairly rapidly spiritually. I remember in the second grade, just one day thinking, Jake, when are you going to start getting serious about the Christian life? You need to be reading your Bible every day. And so it's like, okay. And that's all right. I mean, that's a little hardcore, but that was my experience. Yeah.
And I think that's such a great point you make too. Of sometimes, we can grow up hearing about the gospel, learning about Jesus, and we have all this head knowledge, but until it reaches our heart, that's whenever we really see the life change.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, now, of course, you are a believer.
Right.
You're working in creation science. At that point, when you came to accept Christ, did you understand the doctrine of biblical creation to an extent, or did that come later?
Well, it kind of came later. When I was in middle school, I started having some intellectual doubts about the Christian faith, and it wasn't even really specifically evolution. It was more general, like, how do I know that what I've been taught is true? And so I started having those questions. But what happened was, and of course, when you go into middle school, that's when they start teaching you about evolution and millions of years. And it's kind of interesting. The teachers I had for those classes, I believe, were Christians, but they had to teach the standard story. But I suspect at least one of them wasn't very comfortable with it. But anyway, you start having questions, and I don't remember exactly how this happened, but we had a close family friend who loaned me a copy of the book Scientific Creationism by Dr. Henry Morris. And I read that, and I was hooked. I mean, I was just so excited. And of course, I'm in middle school. I can't say I understood all of it, but I got enough out of it. There's like, oh yeah, there are reasonable scientific answers to these questions. And from that point on, I was hooked. I remember we took a trip to Disney World when I was in the 7th grade, and I had a copy of the Genesis flood. And people may remember way back in the 70s, there was a TV movie or a movie called In Search of Noah's Ark. Well, I had the book based on it. So I was just eating this stuff up and couldn't get enough of it. And so that basically ignited a lifelong passion for this subject in me.
Wow. What a full circle moment. Just the fact that you were touched by ICR materials from as early as middle school.
Yeah.
And they encouraged you in your faith, especially as you were starting to hear about evolution, the Big Bang, all these conventional ideas. And now you actually work for ICR.
Yes. And a lot of the other ICR scientists have told me they were influenced by that book. The Genesis flood had a big influence on a lot of people, but so did the book Scientific Creationism. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And so whenever you were, learning about these scientific topics, you were growing in your faith, were you looking to be a scientist even at that time? When did that desire in you sprout to actually go into science?
I started getting interested in science, I think, in about the 4th or 5th grade. I remember that was when I was in the elementary classroom, sometimes you could read for free time, and they had these books on astronomy. And these were old books, probably from the 1950s, and they had all these black and white photographs of spiral galaxies. But even though they were in black and white, I was mesmerized by them. I thought these are so beautiful, and I started to get interested in that. And I had a 5th grade teacher who did a lot to encourage my interest in science. She got me a packet from NASA that had all these beautiful space photography posters. It was really neat stuff. And I think I still have it. And my parents also encouraged me. They got me a telescope. Of course, I wasn't very proficient at using it. About the only thing I could find in the night sky was the moon. But I could at least see the moon with the telescope. And so I started getting interested in it at that point. I also remember in the 4th or 5th grade thinking I might like to be an astronaut. But quickly it dawned on me, I don't think I'm tough enough for that because I don't like roller coasters. I can't handle that kind of stuff. So that was quickly out of the question. And I thought, well, maybe I could be an astronomer because I was kind of interested in astronomy. But I think my interest in physics, it really happened when I was a junior in high school. I was in a chemistry class, and we had to do an extracurricular science activity. And for credit, you had to do it. And so the local university, Lamar University, which is my alma mater, they were having a physics open house. And so I went, and I just loved it. They were doing all these magic tricks. They were imploding giant barrels, using air pressure to implode them. They were shooting pencils through blocks of wood. It was really neat stuff. It was fun stuff. And I think that's when I started thinking, I think I'd like to do this. And so by 12th grade, the 12th grade, I decided, I think I'm going to go into physics. At that point, I wasn't necessarily thinking about graduate school, but I was pretty much decided at that point that I did want to do physics.
Yeah, that's awesome. At that moment when you realized, wow, science is fun.
Yeah,
and physics is really cool.
Well, but now when I went to enroll, one of the professors there said, "Now, I don't want you to get the idea it's all fun and games." He wanted to make sure I wasn't under that false impression.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, but it's worth it. It's worth it. it was a ton of work, but now that I've got a job that I love, and I can do it, but you got to pay the price. You got to be willing to pay the price for that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not an easy road, and we're just so grateful for you and all the scientists at ICR who have put in so much work in your education and research to be able to be here and do what you do today.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that you attended Lamar University. Tell me a little bit more about your education. What did that path look like for you?
Well, I didn't waste time. I got my undergraduate degree in 4 years. I also got a teaching certificate because I thought I might like to teach. I never taught in public school. Well, never for any length of time. I did a little bit of substitute teaching here and there, but I did end up teaching in a Christian school for a little while. So, you know, I worked hard, got through there pretty quickly. I do think one of the things I did wrong as an undergraduate is I was a little too worried about my GPA, and I had some opportunities to take some physics electives, and I didn't want to do it because I didn't want to mess up my GPA. And in retrospect, I think it would have helped me. Grad school might have been a little bit easier had I done that. So you can be a little too obsessed with your grades.
Yes, the struggle is real. Yeah, for sure. And so as you were going to college, you're getting your graduate degrees, did creation play a role in that? Where was the biblical creation viewpoint as you were attending school and college?
Well, obviously it wasn't taught at a state school, but it's interesting. The subject of evolution almost never comes up in physics, which I think ought to tell us something, right? The main branch of science doesn't really deal with evolution. That tells you something. It only usually comes up if you get into maybe cosmology or stuff like that. So it almost never even comes up. So that really, it had almost no effect on me. I don't feel like the most intense attempted brainwashing I was experienced to was in the liberal arts, not the sciences.
Wow.
Yeah. I had a few professors that you could tell they were trying to convert you to their way of thinking.
Yeah. Did you hear, just being in the physics field, did you hear a lot about Big Bang and professors?
Oh yeah, they talked about it. I mean, some, and most people there assumed it to be true. But it just very rarely came up. Yeah.
So you got your undergrad, went on to get your graduate degrees, of course, eventually a doctorate,
right,
which is awesome. And of course, during that time, I'm sure you were, working, maybe doing internships. So where did you work before ICR? What was that journey leading up to your
Well, I was in school almost all that time. I did teach in a Christian school for a year. It did not go very well. But then I went and taught at my alma mater, Lamar University, for about 5 years, and that went great. That was the first, and I already had my master's degree at that point, but that was the first time in my life I felt like a professional. And then after that, after I'd worked for the Lamar University system, I came back to school in the Dallas area, went to University of Texas at Dallas, got my PhD, and was then shortly hired by ICR.
Wow. So what led you ultimately to ICR? Because, of course, you were familiar with the materials from a very young age. You knew about the work of Henry Morris and others. What led you ultimately to start working here?
Well, I don't know if it was, I was just interested in doing creation ministry, doing creation work, and I had sent ICR my resume years before I had the doctorate. Nothing ever came of it. But we had a close family friend who encouraged me to send him my resume again once I had the doctorate. And I got a call from Dr. Larry Vardaman one day and wanted to do a phone interview with me. And apparently that went pretty well. And so I came out and did an interview, and they ended up hiring me. So that's kind of what happened. This was not too long after I got my doctorate.
Gotcha. So what year would have this been?
That was 2011.
Okay, gotcha. So you've been here for well over 10 years. Almost.
Oh, yeah. I mean, almost 14.
Wow, that's amazing. And so, of course, during this time that you've been at ICR, you've gotten to work on a lot of really amazing projects. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you worked on and the research you're currently doing? Okay,
well, for the first 10 or 12 years, I was working primarily on the Ice Age. ICR has got a good Ice Age model, and we've had a pretty, there's maybe a few little areas we're still working on, but I mean, it's much better than the secular model. And so I was really just trying to move the ball a few more yards down the field. Dr. Larry Vardaman had already done work in this area, as had Mike Ord, who's a former meteorologist for the National Weather Service. He's the guy who really came up with the Ice Age theory. And so I was just kind of, the reason I was interested in this is it sort of just kind of happened. I'm doing longevity research, and it's getting into this subject of giantism, and I've been fascinated by that for a long time. And so even when I was in my first time in grad school, I was thinking about doing hyperbaric research, because a lot of people speculated maybe the longevity, maybe the giantism has something to do with atmospheric pressure. I was actually interested in that. And so I was leaning that way. And so when I went back my second time to graduate school, I was thinking, well, I'm interested in that stuff. There's a professor here who's doing work that's related to climate. That might be a way for me to get my feet wet, just kind of dip my toe in the water. And so that was really why I did that. It was because ultimately I was really interested in the pre-flood world and things of that nature. And it sort of led into that. But then when I got to ICR, it was easier to work on the Ice Age. In some ways, the Ice Age is easier because we've got more data. It's more recent than the pre-flood world. And so I did a number of things. One thing I did was I found this monster mistake in the main argument for the secular Ice Age theory. It's called the Milankovitch or astronomical Ice Age theory. And basically the story is that over tens of thousands of years, the tilt of the Earth's orbit slowly changes. The shape of the orbit changes a little bit. Sometimes it's a little more circular. Sometimes it's a little less circular, and so on and so forth. And the thinking is that controls the way the sunlight falls on the Earth, and that controls the timing of ice ages. And the mainstream scientists would say there have been 50 ice ages in the last 2.6 million years.
Wow, 50?
50.
Oh my
well,
goodness.
They don't call them ice ages. They call them glacial intervals, but where the ice sheets got bigger. But most people would call those ice ages in everyday speech. It depends on how you define it. Some people would say, if you've got big ice sheets, that's an ice age. So if that's your definition, you could say we're in an ice age right now. But most people don't think of it as an ice age because the ice sheets are not as big as they used to be. So if you're talking about just a time when the ice sheets got larger, they think there were 50 of those. And the reason most people believe that theory is because of a paper that was published in the journal Science in 1976 called The Pacemaker of the Ice Ages. And it's a well-known paper. I mean, it is considered a really important paper. And so Mike Ord had never really gotten into dissecting the purported evidence for this theory. He made some other criticisms of it before, but I thought let me look at this. And somehow I was trying to figure out how they date ice cores, how they date seafloor sediments, and in the process of doing that, I realized that in order for them to get their results, they had to use an age assignment that they themselves no longer accept as valid. And that age assignment was critical. You could not get statistically significant results without it. And it was the most recent flip or reversal of the Earth's magnetic field, okay? They claim it was, today they claim it was 780,000 years ago. I mean, you can look it up on Wikipedia. They'll tell you 780,000 years ago. But back in 1976, they said it was 700,000 years ago. Now, that may not sound like a big difference, but the time scales they were talking about in that paper were less than 500,000 years. So if you change something by 80,000 years, it's potentially significant. And so what I did was I went back and I redid the calculations using the new number, and it messes it up. And I have to say that the mainstream scientific community did not make it easy. It's very weird. Despite the fact that this is such an important paper, I could not find the original unaltered data anywhere. I just could not. It's bizarre because sometimes there were like 6 or 7 versions of one of the data sets, but not of the one that was actually published, which is very weird if you ask me. So what I had to do was I had to carefully reconstruct the data sets from the figures in those papers. I blew up the figures, put a grid on them, and reconstructed them very carefully as best I could. And so as far as I know, my reconstructed data set that was used in that paper is the only one that's publicly available. And it's on the internet. Anybody can get it if they want to. It's in a tabular form. They can get that data if they want to. But I went back and redid the calculations, used the exact same methodology they did, but I used the age of 700,000 years. Now, I don't believe that magnetic reversal is 700,000 years old. We think that was all triggered by the Genesis flood about 4,300 years ago. But even when you accept their numbers, it's messed up. And I think the mainstream scientists realized this around 1996. If you read between the lines in the technical and popular science news literature, I think they realized what they had done, because there was almost a near panic in 1996, and they never came right out and said it. I think somebody pointed out to them what had happened, that they had just completely undermined their argument. See, what happened was, this is such a crazy story. Why did they change that number in the first place? Okay, why did they change the number in the first place? Well, once they became convinced that the Milankovitch theory was correct, they used it to date other things. So they would use it to assign ages to other sediment cores. They used it to assign ages to ice cores, and so on and so forth. So about 20 years, maybe 14 years or so after this paper was published, around 1990, the early 1990s, there were scientists who were trying to use this Milankovitch theory to date other sediment cores. Okay, they used this technique called orbital tuning, where they assume the Milankovitch theory is true and they use it to assign ages to the chemical wiggles in the sediments. And they were apparently having trouble getting them to fit in a reasonable way with the Milankovitch theory. So they said, okay, we have got to raise the age of the three most recent magnetic reversals by 5 to 7%. So they did it. They just arbitrarily overruled the radioisotope dates. I don't think people realize that. We're always told that you can just trust those dates implicitly. They overruled their own radioisotope dates and said those dates are wrong. We're redoing this. But here's the crazy thing. When they changed the three most recent magnetic reversals, one of those was the one that played a critical role in that paper. And it just messes it up. And it's not even rocket science. The way they were using the age of that magnetic reversal to assign ages was literally fractions. Okay, it wasn't trig, it wasn't calculus, it was fractions. It was like, A over B equals X over D, and you cross multiply and solve for X. That is literally what they were doing. They were assuming that these sediments were deposited at a constant rate. They thought the top of the core had an age of 0. You had this magnetic reversal at 12 meters. They thought they knew that age, and so they literally were using fractions to assign those ages. And so, for instance, if you looked at the age halfway between the top of the core and 12 meters, say at 6 meters, they would say the age was half of 700,000 years or 350,000 years. That's literally what they were doing. Now, the numbers weren't all nice and tidy like that, but that's the methodology. I mean, literally, you can verify it with a pocket calculator in less than 5 minutes, okay? It's just simple fractions, okay? Now, the problem is, then you start doing the calculus. Then you start doing the hard math. But because that step was messed up, it just messed up everything. And so that was a big deal, because this is it's got huge implications for a lot of stuff, including the way they date things. They use this Milankovitch theory to date. They've probably used it to date hundreds, if not thousands, of other sediment cores. They even use it to calibrate the dating standards in a particular radioisotope dating method called argon-argon dating. So what's cool about this, I don't think people realize just how bad this is a train wreck, because as a creationist, in order for me to refute the ages assigned to those cores, I don't have to go to each one separately and refute it. All I have to do is show that they're tied back to the Milankovitch theory, and the Milankovitch theory is in doubt. And they use the Milankovitch theory to tie ages to this core, and then they connect them to another core, and they connect them to another core, and they connect them to another core. It's like this interconnected spider web. So if that first domino falls, the whole thing collapses. And of course, they've never candidly admitted this to either the larger scientific community or the general public. But it's basically a chronological train wreck. Even if you believe in the millions of years, you've got no good reason to trust those dates coming from the Milankovitch theory.
Yeah, and so you've worked on the Ice Age and just research on that for many years at ICR. And more recently, I know that you've got into longevity and exploring fossil evidence for greater longevity. Can you talk about that?
Yes. This is probably the most exciting thing I've ever worked on. Not necessarily the hardest thing, but the most exciting thing. And I want to give a shout out to some previous generations of creationists. There were some other creationists named Dr. Jack Kuaza, who was an orthodontist, Greg Beasley, and Donald Patton. And these guys, all three of them said that we should expect delayed maturation to accompany greater longevity. And Beasley and Patton also said we should expect larger body sizes to go along with that. And what's especially impressive about that is that for Beasley and Patton, they were basically getting that straight from the Bible. They concluded, based on the ages in Genesis chapter 5, that pre-flood humans were taking longer to sexually mature because the youngest age at which a Genesis patriarch has a son is 65. That's the youngest age. Now, we don't know if they were all firstborn. Some of them, I'm sure, weren't, but it's a good bet some of them were. And even if they aren't firstborn, 65 is still pretty late in life to be having kids, okay? So were people hitting puberty at 13 like today and everybody just chose to wait 50 years to get married? Kind of doubt it. I think that is strong evidence that they were taking longer to mature. And that's exactly what Patton concluded and Beasley concluded. And they also concluded, hey, if it was happening to people, it was probably happening to animals as well. And based on the fact that they already knew that giantism is all throughout the fossil record. You got these very large animals, even animals that are still around today. The fossil versions in many cases are much larger than their modern day descendants. And so they said, hey, we ought to expect to find these things with greater longevity. Well, they didn't really have a whole lot of data to work with at that point. There was some data that was starting to come out, but I don't think they were aware of it. There were some books in the 1980s on biological scaling and why living things are the sizes that they are, but they never referred to them. I don't think they knew about it, which makes their prediction all the more impressive because it was basically coming straight from what they already knew about the fossils in the Bible. And so they said, okay, you would expect greater body size and delayed maturation to accompany greater longevity. Well, what we're finding out now is we're actually seeing that. There is a relatively new field called sclerochronology and skeletochronology where you can count growth rings in hard body parts of animals. And you can count them kind of like tree rings. And they can actually make growth curves that show you how the size of the organism changes over time, how its length or height changes. And what you typically have is you'll have a period of rapid juvenile growth that levels off and the creature no longer gets bigger. Now, the creature may get fatter, okay, but it's not going to get bigger or taller, okay? So you have this typical curve that kind of looks like this. And they've been doing all these curves, and they've done it a lot for fossil clams and oysters. And what we find, I think we've got pretty strong evidence, I say very strong evidence that some of the clams and oysters that today are extinct once had very long lifespans compared to what we see today. Not only that, I think we got pretty strong evidence that at least 5 clams and oyster genuses that are still around were once living much longer than they are now. I think we got pretty strong evidence for that. And there's evidence from other animals too. It's not as abundant, but we've got evidence from these giant crocodilians. People have made growth curves for those. It looks like those were taking a long time to reach maturity, and they were very large, much larger than today's crocodilians. Same thing with these giant fossil sharks. Occasionally, you will get a shark vertebra that's been calcified, and there's growth rings in there like tree rings you can count. And in one of them, they had a megalodon vertebra where you had 46 growth bands that were evenly spaced. Well, the assumption is usually that the spacing is proportional to how much the total length grew during that time interval. So what that means is if they're evenly spaced, that means they're growing at a constant rate. So that means it's still a juvenile. The growth has not started to slow down yet. So think about that. You've got a 46-year-old juvenile shark. And there's other sharks out there that look like they were taking a long time to mature. Now to be fair, it is true that sometimes those rings aren't annual. And occasionally they can be, may have 2 a year. But usually the assumption they usually make the assumption that it's 1 per year. And even the evolutionists are saying these things were taking a long time to mature. They were surprised by it. And so we're seeing, and we're finding all kinds of evidence for this, and it's just really exciting. I think we've got evidence that the pre-flood animals were living a lot longer, and I expect that evidence to get stronger as time goes by.
Wow, that is incredible. I mean, just to think of the work you're doing here at ICR, I mean, you're showing how an ice age, the one ice age that we've experienced on this earth is able to be explained by a global flood, how fossils point to pre-flood longevity. And really, I mean, you're doing this work all for the kingdom, all to point people to Jesus. And it is so evident that you love what you do, which is amazing. And so, for people who are listening, who maybe are interested in science or they're wanting to become scientists, how would they know that they're being called to creation science, or that might be a field to pursue?
Well, I think they're going to have a burning passion for it. And it's interesting. I've met people who are Christians who are scientists who aren't necessarily into creationism, and they are creationists, but they're not as gung ho about it as I am. And I think you're going to have a burning passion for it. That's really never goes away. You just kind of feel like you have to do it, and I think that's kind of how and I think that's really the way you kind of discern God's will for your life in general. He when he has something for us to do, he usually gives us a strong desire to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a peace, despite the challenges, despite, the adversity you might face, and of course, a world that can be often hostile to what we believe. There's a peace in knowing that the Lord is with you and guiding your steps along the way. And so if someone is wanting to pursue creation science as a career, they know that that's where they want to head, that's the ministry they want to be a part of. Do you have any advice just in confronting the struggles and the challenges of conventional academia?
Well, one thing is we don't want you to be dishonest, but you don't necessarily need to advertise that you're a creationist. I will say that when you're in the really hard fields like engineering, physics, chemistry, the odds of persecution aren't that great. It's when you get into stuff like historical geology, biology, those kind of things that the odds of persecution are greater. But they're really, strangely enough, I didn't have much of that. I had maybe a little bit of persecution, but not too much. So I would urge, discretion. Think carefully about, whether you want to tell them about it. Again, you can't lie, but you may need to fly under the radar. You may need to just kind of not make a big deal about it for a while. Another thing I would urge is study hard. Sometimes as an undergraduate, I felt guilty because I felt like I was an overachiever. And in retrospect, I do not feel that way. I feel like, if anything, I should have worked even harder, So work as hard as you can. Work to really understand the material, because it all builds on itself. Right. So if you get a weak foundation on one level, it's going to be that much harder when you go on to the next level. So you almost have to be a little bit OCD about it, and just, plugging up those gaps in your knowledge and making sure that you understand the material. Another thing I would recommend is that when you're choosing the school you go to, a lot of people say, I just want to go to a big name school. That's not necessarily a good idea. you want, first of all, if you're serious about research, you need to find a school that has a research program that covers what you're interested in. Okay, that was one of my mistakes. My first time through graduate school is that I just said, "Oh, I'm going to go to this big school." I had no clue what the research program was like. There really wasn't all that much there that I was interested in. I was basically miserable. But you want to find something that you're interested in. And also, if you're serious about doing creation ministry, you need to realize you're not going to get rich doing it. So you want to try to avoid a ton of student debt if you can help that. It might be better to go to a smaller school, save money, and not end up with that big debt. That's something to consider. That's really is something you got to think about. I've got also miscellaneous other pieces of advice if you're going to graduate school. If you're going to a graduate program and they've got a test to see how you can do, I would urge you to take it because sometimes the program where you go may be more rigorous than the one you came from, and you could end up getting in over your head. But a lot of them, if that happens, they'll let you take the undergraduate classes and get caught up. If they don't, but I was not aware of that my first time around. And I think ultimately God used that for good because I do believe he wanted me at UT Dallas. And because the work I ended up doing there, I think is potentially useful for the church. And had I succeeded the first time around, I don't think I would have really, it would have been very helpful when it comes to Christian apologetics. So those are just, some pieces of advice I've got. I jokingly tell people I have a lot of free advice to give because I did everything wrong the first time. But those are some things to think about if you're thinking about doing creationist work. I would read as much as you can on creationism. Keep up with Acts and Facts and other creation publications. You don't think you have to understand everything perfectly. I used to think I had to understand genetics as well as Dr. Tompkins, and no, you don't. No, you don't. You'll just wear yourself out trying to do that.
You don't need to know everything.
You just need to know the score. You need to know what's going on, and then you can really drill down on the stuff that you're interested in. So those are some pieces of advice I would give to future creationists.
Yeah, that's awesome. And for just even thinking about like seniors who are about to graduate high school, or maybe current college students, are there particular internships or experiences they should be seeking out at this stage?
Well, probably yes. Not you could maybe do creation internships somewhere, but also, there's summer internships, and I didn't do any of that when I was an undergraduate. And in retrospect, I should have. I should have done more extracurricular stuff. And when I say extracurricular, I mean extracurricular physics stuff, research, taking more classes. Like I said, I was a little too obsessed with my GPA, I think it's better to get a broad. Even if your GPA drops a little bit, it's better to cover a lot more material, I think. And I would encourage undergraduates to do that. Learn as much as you can. If you can do research, do it. And just do as much as you can and learn as much as you can.
That's amazing. And so, as we close out this episode, I just would love to end with one more question. What would you say is the most rewarding part of what you do at ICR?
I think it's just occasionally we hear from people and they're very encouraged by the work that we do. And that's encouraging to hear from them and to know that the work we're doing is making a difference. That's probably it. Yeah.
Well, I know we are so blessed by you at ICR, not only in your research, but also in your speaking, in your writing, everything you contribute to this ministry. And so thank you so much for coming on the Creation Podcast today. It has been seriously such an encouragement to me. And I pray that it's an encouragement to thousands, hundreds, however many listeners as well.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Renee. Okay.
Yes. To all of our listeners and viewers, thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode of the Creation Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to like, subscribe, and please share this episode with your friends and family, because it's really our heart to get the creation message and the gospel out to as many people as possible. Now, you'll see right here we have a list of names scrolling, and you too can be on this list by clicking the link in the description below to become a member on YouTube or Patreon. So while these names are scrolling, I have one more question for you, Dr. Hebert, from Andrew Yanucci, and he says, please discuss the shape of the earth. Flat earth movement is growing, and it denies the beauty of God's creation for what it truly is.
Yeah, no, the earth is definitely a globe. Okay, it definitely is. Okay. I mean, there's multiple ways you can prove that. I've seen people try to use scriptural arguments to justify a flat earth, but none of those arguments are really convincing. For us, I'll give you an example. People say, well, when Satan tempted Jesus, he took him up on a high mountain, which it does say that, and it says he showed him all the kingdoms of the world. So people say, oh, see, he turned around and looked, and there, he saw everything, therefore it has to be flat. Well, it also says, though, he showed him all in an instant. Okay, in an instant. Okay, that means he didn't turn around. Okay, now I don't know why Satan took him up on a mountain, but you got to read the passage carefully, because it doesn't imply that you saw he was slowly turning around and seeing the whole world. It says he saw it at an instant, and so that's not a good argument. Another argument people use is there's Nebuchadnezzar's dream about this big tree, and it says or it was inside of the whole. Maybe it was maybe not the tree, maybe the statue. But that is problematic too, because it's a dream. And also, even the people who believe the earth is flat don't think like Nebuchadnezzar had people in Antarctica. You gotta. So none of those arguments that they're using from Scripture are really very convincing. And there's plenty of empirical evidence that it is a globe. In fact, my master's thesis, my job was to replicate a mirage. And you had to take into account the curvature of the earth, because it was a mirage that was going over a long enough distance that when you did the ray tracing, you had to take that into account. And you couldn't get it right if you didn't do that.
And isn't there, I might be wrong about this, but isn't there a verse in Job that talks about like the horizon or the curvature?
There's multiple verses like that. One of those, I'm not sure I agree, is really talking about the shape of the earth. Dr. Johnson and I did an article on that. The main thing, though, is there's no verse that says the earth is flat. Okay. By the way, that brings up another point. A lot of times when people make these arguments, it's not so much that the Bible says this. What people will do is they'll take a verse, extrapolate from that verse, and then reach this conclusion. It's not like you have any verse that says the earth is, there's no verse that says the earth is flat. But people will take other verses, make additional assumptions, and then conclude the earth is flat. And so you got to be careful about not going beyond what the text actually says.
Yeah, amen to that. And Thank you again, Dr. Hebert, for coming on today's podcast. And to all of our listeners and viewers, we'll see you next time on the Creation Podcast.